Tim is a wildlife scientist. His background here, if you're not familiar with Tim, he is his degree was in ecology and biology, his undergrad, and his master's. Now, I feel kind of funny about this because I didn't know this until this morning, but he has his master's degree from, can anybody guess? Auburn University.
War Eagle.
And you've had experience in Minnesota, Wisconsin, down in Alabama. But just for the people who might not be familiar with you, just give me the elevator pitch on your background.
So I grew up in Rochester, Minnesota. I've been hunting since I can remember, just out of the backyard. When I was a kid, we used to just feed deer right in the backyard, and I got to watch deer all the time, so I wanted to pursue that as a career. Went to Point for my undergrad, studied wildlife ecology and biology. Mainly worked with ducks at Stevens Point, but did also some deer work there. And then the opportunity came up at Auburn. I couldn't pass it up, so it was basically an opportunity to go catch and release hunting in the capture facility there at Auburn.
Which is pretty fascinating. We were talking about this a little bit off the air. Now I know I'm a homer on this because Dr. Ditchkoff has written for Deer and Deer Hunting for many years, and actually what I found funny is when I first met Steve Ditchkoff, I'm like, dude, you're not that old. I mean, he might be younger than me. But John Ozoga, the preeminent deer researcher in America, in my opinion, John's retired. He still contributes. John's in his 80s now. But John was citing Steve's research for well over 25 years. And the things that they have done at that facility, they call it the Deer Lab at Auburn, just boggles my mind because it's stuff that you're not really seeing in other places in the country.
Right. Yeah, it's a very good mixture there between free range and controlled science because it's just a big open facility. It's not like some of the other research facilities that it's like very small pens and they're doing very small research projects. This is like a bigger picture type
much
thing.
Bigger picture thing, and that's the thing that I try to tell people is that when you, just from my experience doing this for almost 30 years here at Deer and Deer Hunting, the scientific research on whitetail deer is something that you will not, I can't get my head around it. And the guys that are doing it and gals are pretty much completely objective. They have no stake in the game. They're not hunters. Well, some of them are hunters, but they're not taking it from a hunting perspective. They're basically taking it for the good of the resource perspective. And that's one thing that I've really appreciated, especially in some of the things that we've seen. Some of the projects you worked on there, I know were varied. You worked on habitat, and
so I was focusing on the inside the research pen. I was looking at basically the connections between males and females and what specific types of females were attracted to certain males. So it was basically sexual selection. So I was capturing mostly the does and then getting a transmitter put inside of them so that when the fawn came out, it changed temperature. We got a signal that the fawn was on the ground and could run out there and get a DNA sample and then build the pedigree based on the DNA because we had DNA of all the captured bucks. So we could figure out who the father was. So we built parentage analysis, and I published a paper in the Journal of Mammalogy that was related to sexual selection and what bucks were breeding the does, and it was interesting. It was very much a reflection of what was there. So when you had a lot of younger bucks were doing the breeding. As time progressed and there was more older bucks in the population, the older bucks did majority of the breeding. But still, there was always younger bucks that were getting a chance to breed because, the scramble competition of the rut, the bucks can't take care of all the does at the same time. So we even had some buck fawns that did some breeding, which is interesting.
That's what I was going to ask you, because actually, I didn't know that until now, but we actually published, Steve wrote an article based off your paper, I believe. It was called Two Fawns, Two Fathers, and basically saying what the preponderance of multiple paternity was for fawns.
Right.
Could you shed, this is kind of off topic before we get into our main topics, but could you shed a little light on that? Because you did mention buck fawns are doing some of the breeding, and what percentage of yearling bucks, even in a finely tuned herd, as we say, what percentage would be yearling bucks in some cases?
It would be as much as 20%.
Wow.
It's a bigger number than people think. People think, like, oh, I got that old buck out there. I want to keep him for breeding stock. He'll do all the breeding, and that's just not the case. So
isn't it the case too with deer in the fact that, okay, you get a doe that's locked down, and she's and there's just say a mature buck has got her locked down, but she might get bred by him, and then he lets his guard down, chases another buck off, and one of those other little bucks or younger bucks runs in and breeds her, and then boom, you got
multiple paternity,
which is fascinating stuff.
Yep. And I always thought that it was the case where a younger buck does the first breeding, and then a bigger buck comes along and chases him off. But after talking to some of the guys that have smaller research pens and basically just watch deer breed right through the facility, and they we're talking free range practically at Auburn because it's a big fence, but when they're in the smaller pens and there's getting multiple paternity, the bigger buck will breed first, and then he beds down and just could not care less what happens to the doe. He's smoking a cigarette.
Exactly right.
And another weasel comes in and gets another shot in,
and then boom, you've got and that's the other thing that I find I guess not funny but ironic is, people will say like what you said, well, we want to pass that deer up so he can spread his genes. Well, that's kind of like taking this bottle cap and throwing it in the wind, because it's maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
If you're basing a harvest decision off of that, probably not a great idea.
Right.
Probably should be worrying more about your densities. Maybe taking more does out, maybe shooting more bucks, depending upon where you live.
Yep. And this could lead into a longer discussion about genetics and their role in antler growth, because a lot of people, especially down south, where they have some pretty bad soil, they always thought they had a genetics problem. In the lower coastal plain of Mississippi, it was really a nutrition problem, and they figured that out. My buddy, Dr. Eric Mitchell, he did a study basically looking at generations and how the impact of nutrition on those, coastal plains deer could get better with generations of good nutrition, and they did. So they didn't have a genetic problem. They grew as big of antlers as the deer from the Delta, which is, black soil like Buffalo County.
Yep.
And they grow big deer there, but the coastal plain deer could grow just as big if you give them the right nutrition.
Which is so, like I said, you and I could sit there and talk about this for hours. We might bore some of these people to death, but it wouldn't bore me to death, because the thing is nutrition, and that's what you're doing now at Ani-Logics. You're developing products. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but these guys, this isn't just some facade company. These guys are actual scientists, which is I really appreciate. We're going to get into that, but we're talking about nutrition, and then the other thing that I probably shouldn't bring up, because you and I would talk about this forever, but social stress in the deer herd, and that I think that's what you really get in some cases. Now, we're constantly talking upper Midwest, blah, 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 blah. But I know you find this in the Southeast, you find this in the Northeast, where you have deer densities that are too high, and you have a social structure. John has written about this many, many times, and I try to tell people, read this article 5 times, because it's going to take you that long to absorb that information. But just on the topic, Tim, let's take nutrition out of the balance and just talk about social stress. How does that affect antler growth?
So when you look at the areas that have too much deer eating, the browse and things like that, you can look into the woods and you can see a browse line. So it's stress that is physiological, in that they can't get enough nutrition because they're walking around and they're selecting the best parts of a plant if there's normal nutrition available. But these deer are having to go above and beyond, try and get on their hind legs to try and reach food. If a timber harvest is, dropping trees, they run and grab the fresh green growth that's coming on the fallen trees. So it's stressful living in the wild anywhere, but it's just really stressful if you can't find something to eat.
So you have no food. Well, you have limited food. You have high deer densities. You have a situation where people might not be killing enough does. So that really skews things, because, as we know, those older maternally linked groups are the ones that are controlling the party, so to speak.
Yep.
And then I think the biggest thing for me when I first was learning about this, like I said, John taught me this almost 30 years ago, was when you look in the woods, like, oh yeah, there's all sorts of brush, there's all sorts of understory. Well, if you start looking at it, it's all invasive species. You've got Japanese barberry, you've got bush honeysuckle, you've got all this stuff that deer aren't eating.
Yep, not palatable, doesn't have much protein, might have some toxins in there, some tannins that doesn't taste good to deer, not high quality nutrition.
So that's, I think, where people can, if they want to maybe like just improve their understanding, I always say just start at the molecular level as far as the habitat. Understand the habitat. Just get it. You don't have to understand. You don't have to have a pinpoint like how many deer I have on a square mile, but you have to kind of gauge it.
Yep.
And that might help, especially for people. We're going to be talking to mostly people who are managing land. It doesn't matter if you have like me 9 acres or if you've got like Brad 400 acres. But it does also help public land hunters. Which, by the way, he killed
180 over
he
in
killed
Stevens
a
Point.
180-inch buck when he was college on public land.
Yeah, just
Dude.
got extremely lucky during the rut.
Wow. What was it? A big non-typical or?
It was a mainframe 10. It had 16 scoreable, and it had like split brows and some stickers coming out at the bases.
Damn.
So
Was
yeah.
that just like you blundered into it, or did you know it was there?
I knew it was there. Not there. I knew it was in the neighborhood because, I mean, in college we used to just drive around and shine, the alfalfa fields just to see what was around. Never any intention to hunt the private ground, just seeing what was out there. And that deer was just, I mean, he was a mile away from where I shot him in an alfalfa field.
Wow.
But I knew that area had big deer just from driving around and shining. And then I also had, there was a guy that owned an archery shop that had a ultralight airplane that would fly around the marsh, and he said, "Man, there's some big bucks in that marsh."
Is that the Dewey Marsh?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
Now that I don't hunt around there, I can say where
you
it
can
was.
say that, and I could tell anybody, go ahead, knock yourself out, because it's like the most heavily pressured public land around here. I mean, I'm familiar with it. Okay,
Yeah.
but I digress. So let's talk. I've got a couple I had to list this in topics because I know people are going to want to hear your insights on this. Plus, I'm trying to rein in my excitement. So I'm going to switch gears, Tim. First of all, give us a brief overview on Ani-Logics. If people aren't familiar with the company, I know it started, I think, in 2012.
Yep, 2012.
And just give me the premise of the company and where it stands today.
So back in 2012, that was a really bad year for EHD in Nebraska and Iowa. And that's where some of the ownership had land, and they lost up to 80% of their herd in some of those areas, which, I mean, they're sitting around deer camp with 80% of their herd dead going, man, we got to do something about this. It was, just really depressing. And at the time, they were the part of the ownership of a lab that was, working on vaccines for EHD, and they had a lot of the science background on what that virus is and what it does. And they were also getting into the market of the cattle and swine industries that wanted meat that was never injected with any antibiotics, antibiotic-free meat. So they were trying to grow these animals in confinement with the best health additives that they could so that they could market the meat as no antibiotic-free. And they did that with essential oils. So they did a lot of work with the essential oils that...
So that was in the beef and pork industry.
That was in the beef and pork industry, but they knew the technology existed, so they basically just took part of that technology and made it specific to deer, looking at dosages, body weights, and apply it to a deer diet. And they first started with basically 3 products. It was a granular protein feed, a granular mineral, and a granular attractant. That was the first 3 things that they made, and put all of that technology into the product, and they called it Ani-Shield TX4.
Yep.
So... the vet group, a lot of powerful minds in there, and they put that technology to work into a deer-specific diet. And, oh, by the way, if you put a diet together that is specific for deer and it makes them really healthy, they can grow extremely big antlers.
Right.
So it's all part of the nutrition puzzle.
Deer Talk Now is brought to you by... With more than 70 years of experience in the animal health and nutrition industries, Ani-Logics Outdoors brings its unique expertise to the science of deer feed and attractants. For more information, visit Ani-Logics.com. So it's been, I know the company, I remember when the company first came out, it's been over a decade. What have the results been? Because we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about beef and pork. Yeah, that's great. But now we're talking about free-ranging ungulates. And I know from anecdotal evidence, I guess you would call it, that especially some of my friends in Iowa are swearing by, like, I haven't had a case of EHD in 5 years or something, or we've seen stuff. Is that, you think that's related, or do you think maybe, oh, well, that's just cyclical because maybe the weather conditions weren't quite right for EHD? Or
I think it absolutely has a role in preventing the death rate from getting extreme like it did in, I think it was 2008 was another example, and then 2012. It's not a vaccine in that it's going to prevent all death loss, but what we've seen is the guys that can put it through their deer herd most consistently are not having the issues. I mean, they're doing things like prescribed fire and all the other habitat management, doing TSI work, food plots. The nutrition is just keeping the deer as healthy as possible throughout the entire year. And what determines whether a deer lives or dies after they get bit by the midge, it's not going to prevent the midge from biting,
right,
but it's basically going to determine their pre-disease nutrition status.
Yep.
And if they're healthy going in, they got a better chance of coming out alive. So
that is probably, and like I say, from anecdotal reports that I get, you're talking about where you're really seeing the effect is, let's face it, guys who have bigger properties, who are trying to manage for older age class deer, and they're just not seeing the losses. Like back then, I remember, I mean, when we first started reporting on EHD, this is more than 20 years ago, but guys were losing entire age class. I mean, like not even entire age classes, like multiple layers of age classes.
Right, and I have a theory as to why the oldest bucks get impacted more. The midge likes to bite velvet antlers. So you think surface area, the biggest bucks have the most midge biting habitat, and they just are abnormally more hit by the midge than, your younger age class bucks would be.
So for whoever's listening or watching this podcast, EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease. This is my Michael Scott. Explain that to me like I'm 5. What is EHD? How does we know that it affects a deer from a biting midge, which is like a no-see-um, a little tiny gnat.
Yep.
Then what happens?
Think about it like malaria and mosquitoes in humans. So the countries that have poor nutrition, poor healthcare system, they get hurt by it the most because those humans are in bad shape when they get bit. Whereas a industrialized country that has fully healthy humans, they can get bit and get treated for the virus, but it's a virus. It attacks quickly. They get high fever, and that fever causes them to want to go to water. So typically they'll be, around a creek, pond, and they'll be dead within 24 to 48 hours of disease onset because they haven't built up the immunity to that specific virus serotype. So there's a lot of different types of virus. Some of them are called EHD, some of them are blue tongue, and within that there's maybe, that we know of, 15 to 20 different types of EHD and at least a dozen blue tongue. But, I mean, the science is still very in its infant stage. They're finding new varieties every year.
So now I'm going to ask you to write an article on that because I did not know that many strains existed. But things that we're lumping in as EHD basically is that virus that's transmitted. How does it come from? I mean, how does the bug get it? Or it's transmitting from the insect to the deer. What's that life cycle?
So I haven't studied the life cycle of that midge very much, but I know that it can overwinter in cattle populations. So the cattle would be a host species, but they're not impacted like deer are. So they basically just carry the virus over the winter, and then another generation of midge comes the following season, bites cattle, and then bites deer, and the deer get impacted by it. So
is that kind of like Lyme disease with the white-footed mouse? I mean, is that kind of the same thing?
Yeah, like there's a carrier.
Because it doesn't actually kill the mouse.
Right.
And that's how I've actually. Okay, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here, but when my daughters were little, I was just deathly afraid of them getting bit by ticks.
Mm-hmm.
So I waged complete, and Ted Nugent actually told me this. He said wage complete war on raccoons, mice, chipmunks, voles, and shrews, which I did. And you would not find any of those on my property.
Wow.
And once I did that, and I swear to God, within 2 years, for the last 5 years I lived at that house, we did not pull a single tick off our kids.
Wow.
And but it's anyways. I
And you didn't keep them in cages in the basement, the kids.
Well, not all the time. Kidding. They're not listening to this, so I don't have to worry about them busting my chops on that. That's absolutely fascinating. One other thing I want to ask you about EHD. I've shot a couple deer now on some of these out-of-state trips. One was sorry about that. One was in Kansas, and it had what would you call it? A big, huge clubfoot. Isn't there a condition that? And the guy had told me, oh, that was an EHD survivor. Do they get problems with their hoofs?
Yeah, hoof slough.
Okay.
Is like the common term for it, but it's basically like the virus interrupts the growth of the hoof tissue, so then it creates like a brittle end to it, so like the edge of it will slough off and get sometimes an infection. So you'll sometimes see like where they've got some hoof rot from as a result of the hoof sloughing too much and getting a secondary infection from it. So
will that eventually kill the deer, or is it just something that deer's going to live with?
Once again, if they're in good shape and their immune system is firing on all cylinders, then they have a better chance of fighting off the secondary infection. So that's an interesting point. A lot of the deer, that die also have secondary infections. EHD obviously is a thing that puts them in a bad situation, but then they get pneumonia, say, on top of it, or another secondary infection, and that's really killing them because all of the immune system is fighting the one, and you get a double whammy, and the deer dies.
So that is a perfect segue now to our next topic, which is chronic wasting disease. Where are we sitting with chronic wasting disease, in your opinion, in North America? I've used this term. I used it with Dr. Ditchkoff. I used it with a bunch of people on this program. Is this apocalypse now, 20 however many years after the fact, and can we do anything about it?
It's not apocalypse now.
I did not tell him to say that.
Right. It's something that we need to think about, but I don't think we need to overthink it like we are now. From what I've gathered, over the 20 years that I've been interested in it, the animals replace themselves faster than the disease could ever kill any population. And I know that there's been some modeling studies out west where they thought it was going to be the end, but those modeling studies are modeling studies. They're not real life like we see on the ground. I mean, especially here in Wisconsin, where it's been prevalent for many years.
Yep.
And they're still shooting 200-inch deer in southwestern Wisconsin. So, I mean, those deer have to get 4 or 5 years old somehow.
Right.
Even in areas where there's 35% or greater prevalence. I mean, it's different with CWD. So, I mean, EHD is caused by a virus. CWD is caused by a protein that changes shape. And it's kind of like frying an egg. Once the egg is fried, you can't make it into an over easy. So that protein changes shape, then it's stuck there. And then that disease progresses in that animal. But you always see, the news articles that say, it's always fatal. But what you don't hear is how long it takes to be fatal. And not every deer dies within the same time frame. I mean, I know there's deer that have lived in the free-range situations where they've captured the individual, known it was CWD positive, put a collar on it, and let it go, and they're still alive 4 years later. Everybody thinks they're going to die in 18 months, but some of them don't. Some of them take 4 years to die. So there's genetic susceptibility, and it's not the exact same throughout the entire herd. So some of them, they die quicker. Some of them, they have a genetic preponderance to live longer, and those deer are going to replace themselves even more because they can produce more offspring in that time that they're still alive and not showing any clinical symptoms of CWD. So, this doom and gloom, this is the end. Let's shoot every deer in sight. That doesn't seem like very good management, especially when these state agencies need the hunters and the income from the license sales to have what they can to manage the properties and the herd.
That's something I've been saying all along, and it's interesting to hear your take on it. So what is the biggest thing is I see from what's happened after it was found east of the Mississippi here in Wisconsin, everybody's freaking out. And now we've basically got into this pattern. We're going back to 2002. So we're talking 21 years now, where it's like Tennessee reports for CWD. Yeah, I get it. I'm not a non-believer. I believe the disease exists, obviously. Is it, and the thing is, I think, no, it's always fatal, Schmidt. And I'm like, okay, no, that's what some of these, DNR lapdogs are saying.
Right.
And it's like, but to my point is what you're talking about EHD is, okay, yes, this deer has CWD, but it's living another 3 or 4 years. It might be getting killed by a mountain lion, or it could be getting killed by a coyote or a timber wolf or a black bear or whatever.
Yep.
Did it have CWD? I think we need to study it. Study what? I mean, as far as where it's located everywhere. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying is, where do we go from here? I mean, do we just dismiss it? Do we just more research is needed? That's what they probably always told you back in school.
Right.
Where do we go with CWD? I've asked so many people this question, and it's really hard to get a straight answer.
Right. I think the future of CWD management is actually going to be going back to the principles of wildlife habitat management and biology. It's going to be having sound herd management, and it's going to be some sort of technology that could be put in a product, whether it's a feed, mineral, something that you could put on the landscape that would prevent the prion, the protein, from turning into the bad shape, and it would basically just sit in the animal, and if they got a bad prion, they would just send it right through, and it would come out the other end and never actually soak into the central nervous system. That's what I think the future is. There's a lot of work to be done, obviously. There was one study in Colorado where they had some success with a vaccine, but their efficacy, no, I said that wrong.
I know the word, I can spell it, but I don't know how to say
it. The efficiency of the vaccine, the efficacy, was only 20%. So the one out of 5 that they were trying to give CWD to, it had a response. It was like a mucosal response that it would not allow the bad prion to get into the central nervous system. So it would just send it right through. And I always wondered why they didn't keep that study going. They ran out of funding.
Right.
I could not believe that. They needed another like $1.6 million, and they couldn't get it. This was back in 2015, and the CWD funds had kind of dwindled at that point. But there was this animal that basically couldn't get CWD because of the vaccine that they gave it, but they had to end the study after the funding was done, and they euthanized the animal. But they saved all the blood, all the tissue, everything they could. So if they need to recreate another animal like that, they would have the genetics for it. But I think you think about evolutionary timescale, it's hard to imagine with us humans because we live in such short lifetimes, but 1,000, 10,000 years from now, what's the landscape going to look like? CWD is basically a slow-burning brush fire. Eventually, it's going to be everywhere if they keep testing for it. It's just going to slowly move across the landscape. Well, you fast forward many, many, many generations, there's probably going to be some evolution where the deer that have better genetics, more resistance, are probably going to win more of the time. So they're going to pass on their genes, and eventually there's going to be a better resistance to it. That's evolution 101.
So what have they done with mad cow disease?
So with mad cow disease, they were able to take those herds and, thin out the bad ones and do genetic work so that they could build resistance, and they bred it out of the populations.
So they bred mad cow in Scrapie with sheep as well?
Yeah, same thing. Yep.
Which is fascinating. Now, to your point from about 30 seconds ago, where you're talking about they needed an extra $1.5 million, which is absolutely nothing. And this is my soapbox moment, is that $1.5 million in research. So everybody was like sitting there jumping up and down here last year, when they passed that federal whatever thing, and they put, I don't know, it was like
$70 million, wasn't it?
$70 million.
Yep. And most of that's going to testing.
Which just absolutely grinds my gears, because it's like, if this is such a big deal, and I know, and I'm not bashing people personally, but people in agencies are like, well, we need to test. I'm like, yes, we need to test, but if we're going to spend money, I want people in lab coats with test tubes and shit. I'm sorry. It's testing the disease, finding out about, because if this is the chapel burning down, we need to be not just wondering like, well, why is the chapel burning? I don't care why it's burning down. You're telling me that it's burning down. How do we put it out?
Right.
And that's my humble opinion. I think that's what we need to be doing. The other thing, I don't want to be beating this into the ground, but now some people are going to say this, well, the guy works for Ani-Logics. It's a company that makes minerals and feeds and stuff like that. But let's talk about just a topic that's related. The biggest thing that I see, and I see it's a lazy crutch for people who don't want to deal with it. Well, we got to do away with baiting and feeding, and we have to do away with, mineral usage and other thing where deer, nose-to-nose contact. That's where this is being. I'm just going to throw you that softball. Tell me your thoughts on that.
So the thing about it is deer, our social species, they're touching each other all the time naturally. So if you remove one instance where they touch throughout a day, maybe it's at a mineral site or at a feed location, there's still the 15 other interactions. So like it's doing so little that in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to impact anything. And I'll play devil's advocate when I know that in areas where you cannot feed or use any minerals, but we're still selling it on the shelves at the feed stores, right, I know they're not taking it up to northern Wisconsin. Right. So you think about a landscape level, it's probably worse in a feeding ban because, say, before there was a ban, you had 20 mineral sites in a section. Now you have 3 because there's still people doing it illegally. So instead of concentrating deer at 20 different sites and spreading them across the landscape, now you've got more deer coming to each site. So it's an impossible situation for any agency to control unless you want to, send the government out and search everybody's land, which is...
And they can start taking our guns away too.
Right, yeah, at that point, your human rights are gone.
That's a very eloquent way of putting the point that I wanted to put on this, and thank you for doing that, because it's kind of like the same thing with you drive down Highway 41, you're on your way from here to Chicago, and you'll go every couple miles, you're going to see a fireworks stand. You legally can't throw those fireworks off. But I tell you what, you walk out my back door on July 3rd and people are freaking lighting M80s and all sorts of stuff.
Yep.
It's the same thing. But getting back to the point with baiting and feeding, again, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, a lazy crutch by the state or whoever's implementing these bans, well, at least we're doing something.
Right, yeah, they got to do something. They feel like there's a low-hanging fruit. We are trying to manage the disease, and that this is the first thing that we need to do. But in reality, it doesn't do anything.
It doesn't, and it also translates over to, I feel so bad for anybody who either likes to use scent. Some people say, well, I never had to use deer. Fine, that don't. But I know a lot of people who like to use scent and use it efficiently. And now we've had states come along, same thing. We're banning natural-based deer urines from herds that were tested, meticulously to be found CWD free. And they're saying, well, at least we're doing something. If you look at that research, Dr. Davin Henderson from Colorado, who was the one who actually put out the research on nose-to-nose contact and urine contact and saliva contact, saying that is the least known vector to, I think he said you'd have to, if correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, you could probably look this up, but I think he said 30,000 if you took 30,000 gallons of infected urine, think about that for a second. I don't know how much is a milk truck. How many gallons in a milk truck? Okay, 30,000 gallons, probably many of those milk trucks. Inject it into the brainstem of a whitetail, you're going to affect 1 gram of brain protein. Mm-hmm. But they have now it's the brainwashing of the public thinking, oh my God, yes, no, we can't use natural urine.
Right.
Which is ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
Right?
Yep.
This episode is also brought to you by Moultrie. Moultrie Mobile's Edge Trail Camera is affordable and easy to set up. The camera works on multiple networks nationwide and even has built-in storage. That means no SD card required. For more information, visit moultriemobile.com. Okay.
And, you think about vectors for the prion to be moved. Would you cancel all interstate travel? You can buy a hay bale from southwest Wisconsin, where there's heavy CWD prevalence, and ship it anywhere in the Midwest, and there's probably prions in that alfalfa. Like, they're never gonna shut down the vectors of it moving around.
Well, that's the other thing, and you probably shed light on that. What some of these listeners might not be aware of is that prion lives in many other things other than just the deer itself.
Yeah, I mean, once it's shed, usually in the feces or urine, then it sits outside in the environment, and then it goes into the ground. I mean, they've tried to nuke it with fire and bleach and stuff like that. It's just a very hard protein to break down. So I mean, they've found 10 years of no deer being on a pen, and they come back and introduce deer, and the deer that they introduce can get it. So it's not like the prion can degrade quickly. And that leads me to another point. Did you ever hear what they did with the caribou herd over in Norway?
Oh yes, go ahead. Please.
It was like, I think they found 3 positive animals, so they wiped out an entire herd. It was over 25,000, just wiped them off the face of the earth.
25,000 animals.
Yep, for those 3, and then they're going to reintroduce the herd from another stock in Norway in, I believe they're going to wait 15 years.
Oh my God.
So they're going to have no caribou for 15 years. You think that's going to change the landscape at all around there?
No.
And then they're going to bring them back, and then what if they get it again? Are they going to wipe them out again? Like, what's the end game? You just keep wiping them out, cleaning the slate, cleaning the slate?
15 years, you've got generations of people who won't be here anymore.
Right. It's crazy to think about.
And to your point, that led to that was what Tim was talking about. One of the ones was in the endemic area in Colorado, where they originally, it was Colorado, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Where they found CWD. They basically eradicated that. It was in a pen. They eradicated the herd, burned the soil, disinfected the soil, whatever nuclear waste. I'm just being facetious there.
Mm-hmm.
And left it sit still, reintroduced animals to that pen, and they got CWD. So it was, I don't know. The other thing with CWD is that I find fascinating. What are your thoughts, Tim, on then? So, okay, we have to manage the herd, blah, 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 blah. Is there a place for QDM? And when I say QDM, we all know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about planting food plots and Leopold landscapes with forests. I'm talking about older age class deer. Is that still a viable model in North America to be passing bucks up to let them live 4, 5, 6, 7 years old if we've got a disease that manifests in males at higher levels when they're mature?
That's a tough question, because the older age class bucks that have a higher prevalence of it, I don't think they're impacting the younger deer as much as people think they are. So I think you can continue to have QDM and grow older age whitetails. It might not be 9 and 10 years old, the ultra old, but if you can get a deer to 5, that's a big enough deer. You might instead of targeting 7-year-olds, maybe target, earlier on in the trophy management game, shoot more 5 and 6-year-olds to keep them from getting to 7 and 8. But I wouldn't slide the pendulum all the way so you're eliminating all the 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds so that you're doing anything for disease management.
And let's face it, if you're getting a deer anywhere a sniff close to 5 in most places in North America, because when we're talking 5-year-old bucks, we're talking Kansas, Iowa. And why is that? Is it because it's magical? No, it's because there's fewer people. Yep. There's fewer people, fewer hunters, larger properties. If you're talking about New York and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia and even Alabama, those deer you're not getting them to 5 unless you have a big property. Most guys aren't hunting that. Most guys are hunting small properties. So basically what you're saying is if you're happy with a 3, 4, 5-year-old buck, I am. You can see them all along the walls here. You're saying that really shouldn't be having to worry about that.
Right. Yep. I mean, it's such a small percentage of the population, those older age class animals, they're not going to do anything at a landscape scale to prevent accelerate CWD across the landscape.
Deer Talk Now is brought to you by 10-Point Crossbow Technologies. Whether I'm in a tree stand, ground blind, or spot and stalk hunting, I know the Nitro 505 is up to any challenge. Check one out at a dealer near you or log on to 10pointcrossbows.com for more information.